Hello, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Michael Granado. I'm a history and philosophy educator, and in this video, and probably the next few videos, I'm going to be breaking down a paper that I recently published. It came out last month. It's called The Music of Memory, Gaston Bachelard and the Construction of Time and Memory. Let me bring this up so you can see the website as well as the paper. So in this paper, I make a specific argument about the philosophy of Gaston Bachelard. He has two works on the philosophy of time, kind of a lesser known figure. He's a French philosopher, so broadly belongs to the continental tradition, but writing on the heels of the famous Einstein-Bergson debate. And a lot of what Bachelard says has very strong connections between early psychoanalysis and specifically as it relates to early psychology and the developments of early psychology about the idea of memory and the role and the impact that memory plays on the kind of emotional and psychological life of the individual. And Bachelard brings that into conversation with kind of larger topics within the philosophy of time. Now, I realized when I started making this video that the philosophy of time is one of those areas of philosophy that is heavily, I guess I could say, it's very heavily laden with jargon. There's a lot of technical terms that philosophers just kind of take for granted that probably don't make a lot of sense to people outside of the area. So I decided that it might be a little bit more helpful and appeal to a wider audience if I make a video introducing these terms and concepts before I kind of launch into ideas of my own. So that's what I'm going to do. A lot of it's going to be, again, terminology and ideas, but hopefully some of you will find this helpful. If you feel like I need to explain something a little bit more, please feel free to ask in the comment section below. If you feel like I explained something wrongly, of course, feel free to do the same. Always more than happy to argue with people in the comments. It's what makes YouTube YouTube. Anyway, let's jump into it. So, first of all, we have this idea of manifest time. Sometimes philosophers will refer to it as folk time. I recently picked up a copy of Sean Powers' The Philosophy of Time. It's an introduction to the subject published by Rutledge, I believe. Yep, Rutledge. And Powers refers to it as manifest time. For the rest of this video, I'll call it manifest time. Some people call it folk time, not to get everybody too confused. Generally speaking, philosophers are referring to the same thing, whether we're talking about manifest time or folk time. But manifest time refers to our everyday experience of time, our intuitive experience of time that we all have. If I were to ask whoever's watching this to describe time, your description would be that of most likely, unless I ask a physicist, and one of you are a physicist to describe time, then it wouldn't be manifest time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Your description of your everyday lived temporal experience would be a description of manifest time, the way time appears to us as we go about our lives. And this is in contrast to the description of time that is provided by physics, which is, generally speaking, seems to be more abstract and on some level seems to be distinct and separate from how we experience time as humans, as people. So in manifest time, we experience time as along our timeline as having a past, a present, and a future. The present moment, of course, seems particularly significant. It feels to us like the now is the moment that we are consciously aware of. And we also have this sense within manifest time that time is moving or that time is flowing, that is going forward, and that the past is something that has happened and that we're moving from the past towards the present, towards the now, and into the future. And so all of this kind of put together highlights some of the key aspects of manifest time that commonly appear in the literature and that philosophers, not people, just imagine people sitting around at a coffee shop talking about different aspects of time that people are making these delineations between time. These are typically philosophers or philosophically inclined individuals. So certain aspects of manifest time appear, and you can let me know if this kind of corresponds to your experience or if you would add anything here. The first is linear progression. So in manifest time, time is often seen as linear, moving, like I said before, from the past to the present to the future. And this is how people kind of naturally think about time in terms of their day to day life. You wake up in the morning, you have a to do list, a schedule for that day, and then you progress linearly through that schedule. No one, completes their work day before they wake up in the morning, unless we're talking about in our dreams. But we think of time as as a form of linear progression. And related to that, we tense out time. Time seems to have specific tenses. And what I mean by that is that the past, present, and future seem to be distinctive or separate from one another. People typically think of these events as having already occurred, as occurring now, or events that will possibly occur, talking about the future, with again the emphasis being on the present, where we experience all of this. And this leads some people to talk about the flow of time, the sense that time moves or that time passes with the present moment constantly moving forward. This is often described by people as the passage of time. Now, these concepts of manifest time, we've seen some variations that occur from people to people, from culture to culture. Some places tend to think about time in slightly different ways, and we know that even from kind of psychological experiences that have been done recently, people feel time differently. I can't remember the name of the study, but there's one study that talked about the experience of time in people in New York City compared to people of that in the Caribbean. And lo and behold, people who lived in New York City perceived time to be moving faster because of their living environment than those people that lived in the Caribbean. So, cultural and social practices actually influence our perception of time and how we measure time, including things like the different sorts of calendars that have been developed historically. And the structuring of our daily life around activities also influences how we perceive time. So within the context of manifest time, memory of course plays a crucial role in how we perceive and understand the passage of time. So manifest time is characterized by our experience of as having a past, present, and future with a strong emphasis on that flow. And memory, as a result, is central to this experience because it is through memory that we recall or bring forward, bring to light the past into the present. So memory will play a very important role in how people, of course, perceive time. And memory is typically taken as the basis for how people perceive the continuity of time. Memory allows us to perceive time as a continuous flow. And memory will serve as a basis for people's basic understanding of the continuity of time. It helps us, like I was saying before, it helps us to connect those past experiences. And it gives us, as a result, a sort of temporal orientation. Memory anchors us as individuals into a particular moment in time. And this is the idea that this is why we put so much emphasis on the present, because it's in the present moment that we can reflect back on our memories and to judge which periods of time are more psychologically important to us than others. And as related to what I was talking about before, memory is often intertwined with cultural practices and social rituals that structure how we think about and relate to time. A good example of this are commemorative events, anniversaries, holidays, especially. I'm filming this in August. We're coming up on the holiday season. There are a lot of associations between the passage of time and specific holiday events, not just us as a culture, But you as an individual, if I were to ask you, for example, about your Thanksgiving memories or your Halloween memories or your Christmas memories, there are particular thoughts and actions, good and bad, associated with those events that you then kind of imply on the holiday itself. Okay, now that we've gotten that groundwork laid, now we can kind of get into discussing the implications that this has for what we call the metaphysics of time. What does this tell us about time as it actually is? So there are kind of two basic positions within the philosophy of time. One is the substantivist position, and the other is the relationalist position. Bachelard, throughout his philosophy of time, is going to put forward, he's actually going to be one of the first early French philosophers to argue for a relationalist position based off of Einstein's theory of relativity. But he's objecting to another French philosopher named Henry Bergson. And I have a separate video that talks about the debate between Bachelard and Bergson. But Bergson is going to put forward what we call a substantivist position. And because Bachelard is largely reacting to Bergson, I'm going to take the rest of this video to outline what the substantivist position is with respect to the metaphysics of time and with respect to how it derives this position from manifest time is ultimately where the foundation of the substantivist position is coming from, at least within the modern sense. So the substantivist views of time is the philosophical position that treats time as an independent, objective reality apart from other aspects of reality, most importantly, separate and distinct from events, and also in some iterations, such as that which you see with Newton, separate and distinct from things such as space. This view has been historically associated with the works of Isaac Newton. This is kind of what popularized it, although Newton himself would not have identified as a substantivist. This is a debate and a discussion that forms well after the time and the death of Newton. And these stand in contrast to relational theories. These relational theories became very popular in the early 20th century, although they date back to people like Leibniz. There's a historical trail with all of this. So there are some key features of the substantivist position that you should be aware of. The first is that time is an independent from events, independent from space, independent from people, that time is an independent entity. Like I said before, time exists independently of the events that occur within it. Time is considered to be a container or a background in which, I don't know, I think pictorially. So if you can think of time as a jar, you put the events, the little pieces of rice. The rice pieces are events. I don't know where this analogy is going, but you got the jar. The glass jar is time, is the container, and then you put events in that jar. But the jar is not defined by the events. The jar exists independently of the events. If there were no events, there would still be the jar. So time is separate from events. Because of this, time is seen as objective and absolute, meaning that it's the same for everyone, everywhere, all at once, regardless of the observer's specific circumstances. If you're on one side of the jar, time is going to be the same to the person who's on the other side of the jar, regardless of how fast they're moving, their location, the pace, whatever. The flow of time, this is important, that the flow of time is uniform and consistent and is not influenced by the different objects' states. As I mentioned before, this is closely associated with the work of Isaac Newton and his theory of gravity, where time is treated as a constant and uniform dimension, much like space. Newton famously referred to absolute, true, and mathematical time as something that flows equally without relation to anything external. So it doesn't matter the object's relation to anything else, distinguishing it from relative or apparent time, which is the time that we measure through clocks and other means. So there's a sort of absolute clock within the concepts of Newtonian physics. Time is a dimension in the substantivist position. Time is considered to be a dimension of the universe in much the same way that space is a dimension. Just as space is a backdrop that contains objects, time is a backdrop that contains events. This leads to the concept of time as a kind of fourth dimension in classical physics, along with the three spatial dimensions. So, the substantivist position is closely related to another position in the philosophy of time. And I'm going to introduce another distinction here. So, you have the substantivist position, which treats time as an entity. Time has certain properties in contrast to the relationist position, which says that time is defined by its relation between two events. We'll cover that in a different video on a different day. And then, based off of that, within the metaphysics of time, you have two primary theories of time, A theory and B theory. And again, since the substantivist position is closely related to the A theory of time, that's what we're going to focus on for this video. We'll talk more about B theory later. So in the A theory of time, also known as the tensed theory of time, time is thought to have certain intrinsic properties that distinguish different moments or events in a way that is dependent upon their position relative to the present moment. A theory posits that time is dynamic and that temporal properties are essential to understanding the reality of time. So, what are temporal properties? In A theory, moments in time are characterized by tensed properties which describe their relation to the present moment. We've actually already covered these, although I'm using a bunch of fancy language to describe them. Events can be characterized as past, present, or future. Past events have already occurred, of course. Present events are occurring now, and future events have not yet occurred, but could possibly occur. These tense properties are dynamic, meaning that an event can change its temporal property over time. For an example, event that is future now will eventually become present and then eventually become past. And the A theory also holds that time passes or flows. And within both A theory and B theory, you're going to get a bunch of different iterations. So some A theorists will hold that the past is equally as real as the present. Others will hold that the present is more real. You get into ideas such as the moving spotlight theory. But within most, I can't say all, because I'm sure there's some A theorists out there who would deny this. But in general, A theory holds that time passes or that it flows from the past to the present to the future, and that this passage is somehow real, distinct property, is a real distinct property of time. Okay, well, I know that was a lot to get through, but it's important to understand because early 20th century French philosophy is not something that is super popular, especially in the United States. Most of my audience coming from the United States, and a lot of these philosophers that I'm going to mention, specifically Henry Bergson and Gaston Bachelard, are not the most well known here in the States. So I thought that it would be important to outline some of the framework that they're operating in. So Bergson is coming from the position of a substantivist view of time, at least to make things a little bit more problematic. That's at least how Bachelard will categorize his position. Bergson himself never really uses this language, but Bergson will argue that duration, that felt time, is at the core of our temporal experience, that we have a strong feeling of duration, a strong sense of duration that we derive from our basic intuitions about reality. And again, I've got quite a few videos on Bergson on this channel if you want to delve a little bit deeper into that. But because of his view and understanding of duration, he's going to argue that time has certain tensed properties. And this is what Bachelard is pushing back against, specifically as it relates to memory, why all of these different positions are important, is because for Bergson, time is sort of leading up to a particular point. And we can talk about that in the abstract sense, but Bergson also means this within the concept of the life of the individual, that your past is leading you up to the present moment. And this presents kind of a form of determinism. Bergson's deeply influenced by Darwinian evolution. So he's presenting, loosely speaking, a kind of a type of biological determinism that Bachelard really is going to, this is the kind of the key point that he's going to push back against, because Bachelard's going to base his understanding of time principally on physics and is going to argue for a relational perspective. And the reason for this, as we'll see in the next video, has to do with the fact that Bachelard doesn't see the past as fixed as Bergson does. He's not going to deny the reality of the past, and he's not going to deny that people have experienced their past. That would be silly. But with respect to memory, Bachelard is going to argue that the relational experience, the relationalist position, that time is defined by its relation between two events, that this allows us to reframe and to reinterpret our memory. And in order to make that argument, he's going to draw heavily on a lot of early 20th century psychology for that point. But we'll get to all of that in the next video. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for watching. Like I said, if you got questions, let me know. If you think that I misexplained something, also let me know, and I'll see all of you next time.